Welcome to the debate. This week, we are focused really entirely on the escalating geopolitical flashpoint in the North Atlantic, specifically Greenland, and the immediate crisis triggered by these recent highly assertive statements from the U.S. administration. This is no longer just a discussion about resources or leases. This is an ultimate stress test for NATO and the integrity of the whole Western security architecture.
It really is a watershed moment. It forces us to reconcile, the theory of great power competition with the practical reality of keeping your alliances intact. The tension is palpable. How do you secure what you see as an existential strategic asset without dismantling the very structure that secures your power globally?
Right. And the trigger event is crystal clear. President Trump's explicit confirmation on January 10th, 2026, of the U.S. desire to gain control of Greenland. His rhetoric was, let's say, maximally coercive. He said the U.S. will acquire the territory one way or another. And the key phrase, I think, was, I want to achieve the deal the easy way. But if we don't do it the easy way, we'll try the hard way. That's an unprecedented level of threat.
Completely unprecedented, especially towards an ally's territory, while U.S. officials are, as we speak, meeting with their Danish and Greenlandic counterparts.
And that rhetoric has to be viewed through the lens of urgency that the president himself laid out. He explicitly justified it by citing this perceived vacuum. He argued that if the U.S. doesn't act definitively, Russia or China will occupy Greenland, and we will not let Russia or China be in our neighbor.
So the actors are clear. You have the U.S. administration, you have Greenland as this autonomous region, and Denmark as the sovereign state. But really, the specter of Moscow and Beijing, that's what's driving the entire clock here.
Exactly. And to fully grasp the severity, you have to acknowledge the existing arrangement. Greenland is part of the Kingdom of Denmark. The U.S., we maintain a presence and defensive commitment through the 1951 Greenland Defense Agreement. But the White House is now signaling that that protection anchored in NATO is just fundamentally insufficient. They want permanent ironclad control.
And this whole policy is just so complicated by the mixed signals we've seen over the last year. It's created confusion, and I think it's potentially undermined U.S. credibility. You have to remember Vice President Vance's statements from last March 2025, where he suggested the U.S. favored Greenland gaining independence and then peacefully joining the U.S. That implied a much more diplomatic, hands-off approach.
That measured approach seems to have been summarily discarded. Just 4 days before the president's threat, the White House issued a written statement, and this was January 6th, confirming that, and I quote, "Of course, the use of the U.S. military is always an option that the commander-in-chief can use." So the internal consensus, it seems, it shifted decidedly away from diplomatic finesse and towards, operational prerogative.
Right, and that shift that really crystallizes the central question for us today is the potential territorial acquisition of Greenland achieved through coercion or even force. Is that strategically sound when you weigh it against the, frankly, irreparable diplomatic cost and the long-term integrity of our most vital alliances?
Well, I maintain that the immediate perceived threat, this idea that Russia or China could gain a strategic foothold in the Arctic, it necessitates swift, decisive, and this is the key word, permanent control. My focus, from an operational standpoint, is on hard power. If the easy way fails, the hard way has to remain a credible and actionable option to secure the homeland from a threat that, can't be mitigated by a treaty alone.
And I just have to come at this from the vantage point of grand strategy, prioritizing soft power and macro stability. Any move to acquire Greenland outside of a mutually agreeable, peaceful settlement would be a profound strategic miscalculation. We already have a treaty commitment to protect Greenland. Using coercion, let alone force, against a NATO ally like Denmark would shatter the foundational security architecture we rely on. The strategic cost of undermining our global influence, it just far outweighs any marginal security gain in the Arctic.
I understand the focus on alliance integrity, but it rests on what I see as a flawed assumption that current defense contracts can provide the necessary defensive certainty we need. The president's reasoning rings true from a security perspective. You can't protect contracts the same way. You have to own it. A lease or a defense pact like the one we have now is just structurally inadequate for the kind of long-term, unrestricted defensive expansion that's required. Sovereignty gives you full defensive capability, full perimeter control. Those are capabilities we simply do not have under the existing agreement.
That is a critical point about the 1951 agreement, I grant you. But the solution cannot be unilateral aggression. We are treaty-bound to protect Denmark, and therefore Greenland. The marginal benefit of full ownership just doesn't justify the strategic risk of fracturing NATO. I mean, a peaceful, negotiated path, maybe supporting independence first, like VP Vance suggested, is the only way to get a stable partner. Otherwise, what you're doing is trading a defense agreement for a deeply hostile, occupied liability that will require a constant drain on resources and political management.
Well, let's talk about the viability of that coercive option. From a negotiating standpoint, the White House explicitly threatening the hard way provides significant leverage. I mean, perhaps maximal leverage. When Danish and Greenlandic officials sit down with their U.S. counterparts, they are doing so under the shadow of an existential ultimatum. This isn't a diplomatic nicety. It's a clear signal of serious intent, which is necessary because the operational timeline, driven by what Russia and China are doing, is closing fast. Leverage is necessary to force a decision.
I disagree entirely that this translates into sustainable leverage. I see it as an immediate toxic deterrent that promises long-term instability. Let's say the coercion is successful. Let's say it forces a cession. The U.S. immediately forfeits its moral and strategic authority in Europe. You don't just alienate Copenhagen, you shatter the foundation of NATO. And then you're forced to divert immense operational resources to securing what would be a newly hostile population of 56,000 people. I mean, where does the operational analyst budget for managing a sustained, low-level anti-U.S. insurgency in the most difficult climate on Earth? That resource drain instantly diverts focus from the primary goal, which is countering Russia and China.
The logistical challenges of a hostile population are real, I concede that. But you are assuming that resistance is guaranteed and perpetual. The U.S. position is predicated on the idea that the strategic necessity outweighs that immediate cost. And that brings us to the operational difference between protection and full ownership. Ownership provides two things treaties do not: uncontested resource access, which is clearly a motivating factor, and more critically, the freedom for unlimited long-term infrastructure investment.
Okay, well, what specific infrastructure investment are we currently restricted from undertaking that justifies this nuclear option?
Under the current 1951 defense agreement, U.S. actions are legally circumscribed by Danish sovereignty and their environmental regulations. So if the U.S. needed to build a new deep-water port on the eastern coast, one capable of servicing nuclear submarines, or if we needed to establish new long-range radar arrays without a lengthy environmental review, the Danish government could legally block it, or at least severely restrict it. Sovereignty, however, it grants the U.S. the complete freedom to establish the kind of comprehensive, permanent defense perimeter that's required for absolute homeland security.
That sounds less like a strategic necessity and more like a desire to just bypass the democratic process of an ally. Framing ownership as a necessity to circumvent Danish law is profoundly provocative and strategically myopic. The 1951 pact already ensures U.S. military action against external aggression. The strategic value of Greenland is primarily in denying its use to our adversaries, a goal the current agreements largely achieve. If this forced acquisition destabilizes the entire Western alliance, leading to, say, a breakdown of intelligence sharing in the Black Sea, or the withdrawal of German support for sanctions, the U.S. has lost far more global leverage than it gained in the Arctic.
But that global structure you're championing is becoming more and more unstable, which is precisely why certainty is now paramount. And this leads directly to the significance of the internal U.S. policy shift, the consolidation from VP Vance's soft line to that written hard line White House statement.
I find that shift less a sign of consolidation and more a sign of systemic dysfunction that our rivals can exploit. This public policy confusion, touting the easy way one minute and then confirming the hard way the next, is a strategic vulnerability. It invites confusion and resistance from Copenhagen and Nuuk because it makes U.S. motives look capricious.
I see the tactical risk in the communication. But from an operational perspective, this signals decisiveness. The administration is consolidating around a risk-tolerant strategy. They're prioritizing immediate territorial gain because they perceive that the strategic window is closing. Vance's diplomatic niceties were overridden by the assessment that only permanent control could mitigate the Russia-China threat.
I'm just not convinced, because this public ambiguity undermines our own leverage. If the U.S. can't project a clear, consistent, trustworthy diplomatic face, it erodes the willingness of Denmark and Greenland to negotiate peaceably, and that increases the likelihood that the hard way becomes the only option left. A confused policy is not a decisive policy. It is a reckless one that guarantees the maximum diplomatic cost for the minimal strategic return.
The lack of perfect clarity could be a deliberate component of maximum pressure, forcing the negotiation partners to respond quickly before rival powers can solidify their own interests. Time is the one strategic luxury we don't have in the Arctic.
And coercion against an ally risks pushing that ally away permanently. If the geopolitical urgency is as high as claimed, the priority should be reinforcing trust with Denmark and Greenland, making them stronger partners against Russia and China, not threatening them with territorial seizure. The certainty you seek through sovereignty comes at the cost of crippling our global credibility.
I appreciate the necessity of long-term stability, but the operational reality suggests that treaties, especially in high-stakes competition, can be broken. Ownership provides defensive certainty when deterrence fails.
And I maintain that the regional certainty gained in the Arctic is purchased at the cost of global strategic uncertainty, crippling the diplomatic structures that allow the U.S. to project power worldwide. The long-term strength of the U.S. derives from its coalitions, not its occupied territories.
And so we've reached the crux of the conflict. The necessity of immediate ironclad strategic control in the Arctic, my hard power view, versus the potential for irreparable damage to vital international alliances, your soft power framework.
We do agree fundamentally that Greenland is of vital strategic importance, and that the presence of Russian and Chinese interests necessitates some form of strengthened U.S. position. The security of the North Atlantic is undeniably linked to the status of Greenland.
Our disagreement is entirely on methodology. I argue the necessity of ownership outweighs the inherent risks because the threat is immediate and the asset is irreplaceable. Certainty must be purchased with sovereignty, even if the price is alliance strain.
And I argue that the geopolitical risks of undermining the international legal framework and attacking a NATO partner are simply unacceptable. Certainty has to be sought through coalition strength and peaceful negotiation, even if that process is slow. The final judgment rests on whether the perceived operational necessity of the hard way truly outweighs the undisputed risks to our entire global security framework.
Much more to explore as these negotiations develop. Thank you for joining us on the debate.